Have you ever woken up one morning and suddenly realized that aging had happened while you weren't looking? That your assumptions about your golden years bear little resemblance to the reality you're experiencing? And wondered why no one told you the truth about what was coming? Last week, I sat with Robert, an 83-year-old retired engineer. As we talked about his life, he whispered, "If I could go back 20 years, I'd do everything differently. Not because I lived poorly, but because no one told me what I really needed to prepare for." His eyes held not bitterness, but profound wish to spare others a harsh awakening he experienced. I've spoken with hundreds of seniors like Robert over the years. Behind closed doors, in quiet conversations when the social masks come down, they share the same sentiment. Why did anyone warn me? They speak of physical changes that no amount of healthy living can fully prevent. Financial strains appear despite careful planning. A loneliness that arrived even with loving families nearby. These aren't failures of individual preparation. They're universal challenges of aging that our youth-obsessed culture rarely addresses honestly. Today, I want to share the precious wisdom from these conversations, the truths about aging that most discover too late, and how you can live fully at any age once you understand what's really coming. Let's begin with the health reality that almost no doctor will tell you directly. Let me tell you about Eleanor. At 77, she still has the straight posture and deliberate movements of the ballet dancer she was in her youth. For decades, she maintained a disciplined exercise regimen. Daily walks, twice weekly yoga, and swimming every Sunday. She watched her diet, took her vitamins, and saw her doctor regularly. She did everything right according to conventional wisdom. Yet at our last meeting, she confessed something that haunts her. "No one told me that despite doing everything by the book, my body would still betray me in ways I never imagined," she said, her elegant hands now gnarled with arthritis. "I thought good health practices were like deposits in a bank account that would guarantee a comfortable withdrawal in old age. But that's not how the body works." Eleanor's experience reflects a hard truth about aging that glossy retirement brochures and medical pamphlets rarely address. We're sold images of silver-haired couples biking along coastal paths or dancing at sunset, creating the impression that if we just exercise enough, eat the right foods, and follow medical advice, our later years will be virtually indistinguishable from our 50s, just with more free time. This comforting narrative overlooks biological realities that no lifestyle choice can completely overcome. "I didn't expect to wake up without pain," Eleanor explained. "But I did expect that the pain would respond to treatment, that the doctors would have solutions. What no one prepared me for was how much of aging medicine is about management rather than curing, and how different that feels psychologically. The first truth no one tells you about aging is that there's an enormous gap between healthy aging, as it's marketed, and the lived reality of an aging body. Even the healthiest seniors experience fundamental changes: reduced muscle mass and bone density, decreased lung capacity, diminished hearing and vision, lower energy levels, and slower recovery from everything from workouts to illness. These aren't failures of self-care. They're biological inevitabilities that can be mitigated but not avoided. What Eleanor wishes she had known earlier wasn't just about accepting these changes, but about preparing for them differently. If I had understood what was coming, I would have focused less on cardio and more on strength training in my 40s and 50s. She reflected, "I would have worked more deliberately on balance exercises when my balance was still good, to build up that neural wiring before I needed it. I would have paid as much attention to maintaining flexibility as I did to maintaining my weight." This reflects a second truth that few medical professionals emphasize early enough. The investments we make in our physical health in midlife determine our physical capabilities decades later, but not in the ways many assume. The focus shouldn't just be on heart health and weight management, though those matter. Equally important are maintaining muscle mass, which begins declining after 30, building bone density before it starts diminishing with age, and strengthening neurological pathways that control balance and coordination. My doctor checked my cholesterol and blood pressure at every visit in my 50s, Eleanor noted, but no one tested my grip strength or measured how long I could stand on one foot, which turned out to be better predictors of how I'd function in my 70s. The medical community's focus on disease prevention sometimes obscures the importance of functional preservation, maintaining the abilities that make independent living possible. Many find themselves blindsided when they realize that it's not necessarily disease that limits their lifestyle, but more subtle declines in strength, coordination, and endurance. Even more overlooked are the emotional and cognitive aspects of physical aging. Eleanor described the psychological impact of changing physical capabilities. There's a grief process no one prepares you for, mourning the loss of abilities you took for granted. Some days I feel angry at my body, like it's betrayed me after all I've done for it. Other days, I feel grateful it works as well as it does. The mental adjustment is almost harder than the physical one. This emotional component extends to how we interact with the medical system itself. Many seniors report feeling dismissed or infantilized by healthcare providers who attribute all complaints to just getting older rather than investigating thoroughly. Others find themselves overwhelmed by medication regimens that grow more complex with each passing year. Each new prescription intended to address side effects from previous ones. By my 70th birthday, I was taking 7 different medications, Eleanor said. When I asked my doctor if I really needed all of them, if they might be interacting in harmful ways, he seemed annoyed by the question. No one had ever sat down with me to explain how these medications work together or whether the benefits truly outweighed the side effects for someone my age. This points to another crucial truth. The standard of care that works for younger adults doesn't always translate effectively to older bodies. Medication dosages, treatment protocols, and even diagnostic criteria developed through research on younger populations may need adjustment for older adults, whose bodies process drugs differently and who often have multiple overlapping conditions. What Eleanor wishes someone had told her earlier is the importance of becoming her own health advocate long before serious issues arose. I wish I'd started asking more questions in my 50s, when I still had the energy and cognitive sharpness to really research and understand complex medical information. I wish I'd found doctors who specialize in geriatric care earlier, not waiting until I was already experiencing problems. And most of all, I wish I'd understood that preserving function, the ability to do things independently, matters more than some abstract definition of health measured by lab values. This brings us to Richard, who at 75 still maintains a precise, analytical mind that served him well during his 40-year career as a financial manager. With his wire-rimmed glasses and careful way of speaking, he embodies the image of someone who has always been prudent with money. And indeed he was. I did all the things financial advisors recommend, Richard told me, sitting in a modest but comfortable home he's owned for 30 years. I maxed out my 401k contributions. I paid off my mortgage before retirement. I diversified my investments and worked with a reputable financial planner. I even had long-term care insurance. By conventional standards, I was more prepared than 90% of Americans. Yet Richard confesses he still found himself financially stressed in ways he never anticipated. The numbers on paper looked adequate, he explained, but they didn't reflect the reality of what aging actually costs, not just the predictable expenses, but the ones no financial calculator can anticipate. This highlights the second major truth no one adequately prepares us for. The true financial cost of aging extends far beyond the neat projections of retirement calculators, even those that attempt to account for healthcare expenses. The first surprise was how quickly healthcare costs accelerated, Richard noted. Even with Medicare and supplemental insurance, my out-of-pocket medical expenses tripled between 65 and 75. Co-pays, deductibles, prescriptions that weren't fully covered, treatments considered elective by insurance but necessary for quality of life. They add up in ways I hadn't projected. This reality reflects a broader truth about healthcare financing in America. Medicare, while essential, leaves significant gaps that can rapidly erode even carefully built nest eggs. The average senior can expect to spend over $300,000 on healthcare costs throughout retirement, even with Medicare coverage. And that figure doesn't include long-term care, which represents one of the largest potential financial risks. When my wife needed in-home care after a stroke, Richard continued, I discovered that my long-term care insurance covered only about 60% of the actual cost. The policy had seemed comprehensive when I purchased it 20 years earlier, but healthcare costs had risen faster than the benefit levels. The difference came out of our savings at a rate that shocked me. This gap between expected and actual coverage is something few people understand until they're facing it directly. Long-term care policies purchased decades ago often prove inadequate against today's costs. Medicare doesn't cover most long-term care services. And Medicaid, which does cover these services, requires essentially depleting assets to qualify, a process that can leave the healthy spouse financially vulnerable. But healthcare represents only one category of unexpected costs. Richard identified several others that financial planning rarely addresses adequately. No one talked about the home modifications we'd need, he said. Widening doorways for my wife's wheelchair, installing a walk-in shower. A stair lift was needed when we could no longer navigate the steps easily. Each improvement cost thousands, none covered by insurance, and all necessary for us to stay in our home. These aging in-place modifications represent significant expenses that few build into retirement planning. The same applies to the invisible support services that make independent living possible as capabilities decline. Housekeeping help, meal delivery, transportation services when driving becomes unsafe, lawn care, and home maintenance tasks once handled personally. I used to change my own oil, clean my gutters, paint the trim when it needed refreshing, Richard reflected. Now I pay for all those services and they're not cheap. My father never had these expenses because he just kept doing everything himself into his 80s. But that's not always possible or safe, something I didn't fully appreciate when projecting our retirement needs. Another financial reality that caught Richard off guard was the impact of sustained inflation over decades of retirement. Even modest inflation compounds dramatically over a 25 to 30-year retirement, he explained. Items that cost $100 when I retired now cost about $160. That erosion of purchasing power happens so gradually you barely notice. Then suddenly you're making difficult choices about what necessities to prioritize. This inflation impact hits fixed incomes particularly hard. Social Security includes cost of living adjustments, but they don't always accurately reflect the spending patterns of seniors who allocate more of their budgets to healthcare, a sector with inflation rates consistently higher than the general economy. Perhaps most troubling was what Richard called the cognitive tax of managing finances in later years. No one tells you how much harder financial management becomes as you age, he said quietly. I was a financial professional, and even I find it increasingly challenging to keep track of required minimum distributions, tax implications, insurance claims, and estate planning updates. The cognitive demands come precisely as your cognitive abilities may be declining, creating a perfect storm of financial vulnerability. This vulnerability extends beyond complex financial tasks to basic protection against exploitation. Financial scams targeting seniors result in billions in losses annually, yet few retirement plans include specific strategies to safeguard assets as decision-making capacity potentially diminishes. What Richard wishes someone had told him earlier wasn't just about saving more. Though he does believe the conventional wisdom of aiming for 70 to 80% of pre-retirement income is woefully inadequate for many. More importantly, he wishes he'd understood the need for flexibility and liquidity in retirement planning. I locked too much money into vehicles that were difficult to access without penalties, he explained. I should have maintained a larger, easily accessible emergency fund specifically for aging-related needs. And I should have spent more time preparing my children to potentially help manage our finances, rather than keeping everything private out of a sense of independence. This points to a broader theme that emerges across both health and financial considerations: the tension between independence, that core American value, and the interdependence that aging eventually demands. Our cultural emphasis on self-reliance leaves many unprepared for the gradual surrender of autonomy that time eventually requires. This brings us to Margaret, a gracious 81-year-old grandmother of 7 whose family photos fill every surface of her well-appointed living room. From outward appearances, Margaret embodies what many would consider successful aging: financially secure, physically healthy for her age, and blessed with a large, seemingly attentive family. Yet, when asked about the greatest challenge of her later years, her answer is immediate and heartfelt. The loneliness, she says softly. Not the kind from being alone. I'm rarely actually alone. It's a deeper kind of isolation that comes from feeling unseen, even when surrounded by people who love you. That's what no one prepares you for. Margaret's experience points to the third and perhaps most profound truth about aging that rarely enters pre-retirement discussions: The emotional landscape of aging bears little resemblance to what most anticipate, and even the most loving family relationships transform in ways that can leave seniors feeling profoundly disconnected. When my children were young, I was the sun they orbit around, Margaret explained. Even as they grew into adults, I remained central to family operations. The holiday planner, the advice giver, the emergency backup, the one who remembered birthdays and held family history. I derived so much of my sense of purpose from those roles. The gradual loss of these central roles represents a form of bereavement few discuss openly. As adult children establish their own family traditions, as grandchildren grow into teenagers with busy schedules, as younger generations increasingly turn to each other rather than their elders for guidance, many seniors experience what sociologists call social death, a state of being physically present but socially invisible. My daughter calls dutifully every Sunday, Margaret noted. She asks about my health, tells me about the grandchildren's activities, and reminds me of upcoming family events. But there's a script to these conversations. When I try to offer advice or share concerns, there's a subtle shift in her tone, patient but dismissive. The message is clear. My role now is to receive updates, not to actively participate in family decision-making. This shift reflects broader cultural attitudes toward aging that devalue the contributions of older adults. In societies that prize innovation over experience, youth over wisdom, and productivity over presence, the elder role loses the status and purpose it once carried. The result is a generation of seniors who've lost their place in the social order without being offered a meaningful alternative. The loneliness this creates is compounded by the loss of peers who share common references and experiences. Most of my closest friends are gone now, Margaret said. My husband, my sister, my college roommate, the couple we vacationed with for 30 years. With each loss, there's one fewer person who remembers me as I was in my prime, who gets my jokes without explanation, who shares memories of events that shaped us. This erosion of a shared history creates a particular kind of isolation, the feeling of being a living archive of experiences increasingly irrelevant to the world around you. Margaret described watching her grandchildren's eyes glaze over when she mentioned rotary phones or typewriters. The world I grew up in, that shaped my understanding of everything, does exist to them except as curious historical footnotes. That creates a distance that's hard to bridge. Technology often widens rather than narrows this gap. While digital tools theoretically offer connection, many seniors find themselves marginalized by interfaces designed without their needs in mind, communication styles that favor brevity over depth, and social norms that evolve too rapidly to comfortably follow. My family created a group chat to keep everyone connected, Margaret explained. But the conversations move so quickly, references fly back and forth to things I don't understand. And by the time I compose a thoughtful response, they've moved on to 3 other topics. I can see their lives unfolding in real time, but I can't fully participate in the conversation. Perhaps most painful is the subtle infantilization that often accompanies aging. People speak to me differently now, Margaret observed. More slowly, more loudly, with fewer complex ideas. They make decisions for me rather than with me, telling me what I'll enjoy rather than asking. My daughter booked a cruise for my birthday, never considering that I might prefer something else. The message was loving but clear. Your preferences matter less than what we think is good for you. This combination of role loss, peer loss, cultural devaluation, and subtle diminishment creates an emotional challenge many seniors find more difficult than physical or financial ones. The mental health consequences are significant. Depression rates among the elderly are troublingly high, yet often go undiagnosed as symptoms are mistakenly attributed to normal aging or physical ailments. What Margaret wishes someone had told her earlier wasn't just to prepare for these emotional challenges, but how to build resilience against them before they arrived. 3 specific lessons emerged from her experience. First, developing identity beyond traditional roles provides essential continuity when those roles inevitably change. I define myself primarily as wife, mother, grandmother, and church volunteer, Margaret reflected. When my husband died and my children needed me less, I had to rediscover who Margaret was apart from those relationships. It would have been easier if I had maintained more of my individual identity all along. This means cultivating interests, skills, and social connections that don't depend on family roles or work identity. Those who fare best emotionally in later years often maintain multifaceted identities throughout adulthood, never allowing any single role to completely define their sense of self. Second, building age-diverse social networks provides crucial support when peer relationships diminish through death, distance, or disability. My one saving grace has been my book club, Margaret shared. We range in age from 35 to 81. Those younger women don't replace the friends I've lost, but they keep me connected to the current world, treat me as a peer with valuable perspectives, and honestly seem to value my presence. These intergenerational connections offer seniors continuing engagement with evolving ideas and cultural shifts while providing opportunities to share wisdom in contexts where it's genuinely welcomed. They also provide social continuity as age-matched friends become less available. Third, nurturing passions and pursuits that can adapt to changing capabilities ensures continuing purpose when traditional roles fade. My friend Helen always loved gardening, Margaret said. When she could no longer manage her large yard, she didn't give up. She shifted to container gardening on her patio, then to teaching gardening classes at the senior center. The activity evolved with her capabilities, giving her continuing purpose and connection. This adaptability, finding modified ways to engage with lifelong interests rather than abandoning them, creates resilience against the loss of purpose many seniors experience. It means identifying the core values and satisfactions behind activities, then finding new expressions as circumstances change. Margaret's journey through these emotional challenges hasn't been easy, but she's gradually found a new equilibrium. I've had to learn to create meaning rather than expect it to come from my traditional roles, she explained. I've had to assert my voice rather than expecting others to naturally seek my input. And I've had to become more intentional about building connections rather than assuming they'll develop organically as they did when I was younger. Perhaps most importantly, she's had to confront and reject the cultural narratives that diminish the value of aging. Society tries to tell me I'm less relevant now, she said with unexpected firmness. But I've decided that's not true. My perspective has value precisely because it's different, because I've witnessed cycles and patterns that younger people haven't yet seen. I won't apologize for taking up space or speaking from my experience. This self-advocacy, the refusal to accept cultural devaluation, emerges as a crucial element of emotional well-being in later years. Those who age most successfully often share this quality, the determination to define their own worth rather than accepting diminished status as inevitable. As we listen to Eleanor, Richard, and Margaret, a common thread emerges across their diverse experiences. Each confronted aspect of aging that contradicted their expectations. Physical limitations despite good health habits, financial strains despite prudent planning, and emotional challenges despite loving families. Each wished for earlier, more honest conversations about these realities. And each eventually found their way to adaptation, not through denial of these difficulties, but through clear-eyed acceptance that allowed for creative response. Aging can be the most beautiful season of your life. Not because it's free from challenges, but because you can enter it with eyes wide open. Eleanor, Richard, and Margaret each discovered this truth through paths that were sometimes painful, often surprising, but ultimately transformative. They showed us that the greatest gift we can give ourselves isn't false reassurance, but honest preparation for the journey ahead. What no one tells us about growing older isn't meant to frighten, but to free us. Free us to make choices now that will expand rather than diminish our later years. The body will change regardless of our efforts, but understanding these changes allows us to adapt with dignity rather than denial. Financial surprises will arise no matter how carefully we plan, but anticipating them gives us flexibility to respond. Relationships will transform whether we're prepared or not, but recognizing these shifts helps us build new connections of surprising depth. The true measure of a well-lived later life isn't the absence of difficulty, but the presence of meaning. Meaning that withstands physical limitations, financial constraints, and social changes. This meaning doesn't come automatically with age. It must be cultivated intentionally, ideally before we reach those later years. If you're watching this while time is still on your side, begin today. Not just the financial planning, though that matters, but the deeper work of building an identity that doesn't depend solely on what you do or who needs you. If you're already walking this path of aging, share in the comments something you wish you'd known sooner. Your wisdom might become the lighthouse that guides someone else toward the shores of greater peace and purpose.